Hi, I'm Chris Predick with Critical Path Training, and today we're going to be talking about InfoPath 2010 and Form Services, specifically how InfoPath 2010 and Visual Studio integrate. Sometimes declarative rules in InfoPath just aren't enough, and we need to enhance our forms with custom code. So what we have the option of doing is telling our InfoPath form that when certain buttons are clicked or certain actions happen, that we want to integrate with back-end code. We can tell it where in the code to go to and where the classes we need to call exist, but we still need to make sure that that assembly is put somewhere. So what the solution is we do our customizations in Visual Studio Tools for Applications. An assembly is built and placed into the InfoPath form. When it comes down to it, an InfoPath form.xsn is a cab file. And in that cab file, we can find all of the XML documents, all of the manifest files that define the form, all the other items that make up what a form is, plus, in the case of custom code, an assembly. So the process of building InfoPath code behind is really choosing what language you want to use, C# or VB, writing your code, and then publishing your form with the code included. That code has access to the object model of InfoPath, and the primary goal of your code behind is most likely going to be to modify the data. The data is exposed via your XML form class and your data source objects. So every data source that you have in your InfoPath form can be accessed as an XML doc using a standard .NET XPath Navigator. So if you can get access to the data model, you can modify the data, and since the UI is bound to that data, the UI will update accordingly. But there is a problem with custom code. If I hand you a form with custom code in it, are you going to trust it? All you know is that I've put custom code in there. I could very well be doing malicious things to your machine. I could be adding software. I could be doing whatever I wanted, as long as your code has full trust. So what we need to do in SharePoint is make sure that our code runs in a partially trusted environment. So to do this, InfoPath Form Services uses a capability of SharePoint called sandboxing. And the idea here is that your code is loaded into a special process that runs with limited restrictions. These limited restrictions are more than enough to do most things we want to do in an InfoPath form, and are restrictive enough that if you try and write malicious code and hide it in a form, they'll be stopped from doing what they want to do. So what ends up happening is our form services application in w3wp.exe, IIS's host process, communicates out to the sandbox services exes on one machine or on a different machine and asks it to execute the code in a special sandboxed environment. Now this does actually cause a performance hit. There is a performance hit, and it is slower, but what you'll find is that performance-wise, it's still fast enough that it's worth the extra safety and not having to worry about whether the code is going to cause problems or have to worry about getting administrator approval to create your form. Now you can run it in a sandboxed environment and be perfectly safe. So we're going to take a look at a simple example where we've written custom code to help manipulate our data model in ways that InfoPath doesn't support natively. So this demo takes advantage of custom code to sort a list. So what we have here is a simple list, and in our InfoPath form, what it is it's a repeating table bound to data in the data set. So no matter how many rows we have, the UI is going to automatically update. And then we have a button here, and what this button does is call some code in the backend DLL that populates the list. So you can see now that it's created some random data for us, and what we now can do is sort. So what these controls here are picture buttons, and those picture buttons are tied to backend code. And when I click this button, what it's going to do is it's going to load the data from the list and then sort it by the first column and then put it back in the list. So all of this sorting functionality is done using custom code that exists in the code behind for our form. So let's take a look at how this works. We can see in our data set that we have a sort table and then a rows repeating structure with multiple fields in it. And you can see that we have bindings here that bind the data here to the different fields, and the entire rows structure is bound to this whole table. So by manipulating this XML document, or the XML document in this structure, in the form, we can customize the way the UI works. Before we go look at the code, let's look at the code options in Backstage and go to the programming section. And we can see that it's already got a project location in place and it's written in C#. If we wanted, we could have chosen VB to begin with, but we can't switch languages after we've started. In this case, we chose C# and it created a project for us. Now, if I go to this button and select Properties, I can click the Edit Form Code button, and it's going to start running Visual Studio Tools for Applications and show me my code. So we can see that we have a Solution Explorer, and we have form code. And that form code contains everything we need to display what we saw on the screen here. Notice that we have an array of values, and this contains all the information that we used when we did the Populate Values button. And then we have an internal startup method that's automatically called whenever the form is created. And what this does is it finds the Populate Values button and attaches a click event in Populate Values Clicked. And what Populate Values Clicked does is it uses a special helper method that we'll look at in a minute to set a repeating table's values using this XPath query. So this myFieldSort table corresponds to myFieldSort table, and it's going to use this two-dimensional array of values to generate XML that meets this structure. So if we look at this code, what we'll see is at the very beginning, what we're doing is we're going and creating a navigator. So this is an XPath navigator that we're going to use to select myFields/sort table. And that's going to get us access to this node. And then we're going to iterate through the main group. We're going to figure out how many children we have, and then move next down onto the rows node. And then we're going to run through each value in the list, clone the current XML structure, and then set the data in that structure. So this uses the values array to generate for us an infrastructure that's going to set, or it's going to generate for us an XML doc that we can then use to generate an XML string that we can use to assign to this fragment. So in the end, what this is doing behind the scenes is right now we have one empty row of data. When we click Populate Values, it's generating 5 rows of data in place and putting them in and populating our UI. So what's important about this is the fact that we can manipulate the data structure behind the scenes. We can use the XML DOM or in the XPath Navigator to build a structure and stick it into the document. When we want to click one of the buttons, like sorting first column, this method gets called, and the first thing we do is we have to get the values out. So this method, get repeating table values, uses an XPath Navigator to find out how many rows and how many columns exist. It then allocates space for that, and then navigates through the data structures using the same basic structure we used before, but in reverse, to pull those values out and place them into an array of strings. So this retrieves the values into an array. We come back now and we sort the table. And this is just standard .NET code that's going to run through a list of data, sort it, and then recreate a list that's already sorted. And then finally, we take that sorted values and we use those same set repeating table values method to store the data. So this is all functionality that's not supported currently in InfoPath. But we can go ahead and make some custom code that'll run this and let it work. Now we could take this same form now and publish it to form services. And the reason we would want to publish it to form services is because sorting is useful. But without sandboxing, how does the framework know that this code isn't malicious? All it knows is that code exists and code could be malicious. So without the sandbox, it would have to stop us from deploying this. Now that we have sandboxing enabled, we can deploy this form and view it online. So adding code behind is a very useful tool. It allows us to get functionality currently not supported by InfoPath. We should try and stay away from code behind to perform tasks that can be performed by the rules, But it's good to know that when we need that extra functionality, we have the ability to write our own custom code that we can ship with our InfoPath forms directly to form services.